Do you ever wonder how God feels about you? I mean, really feels about you. And yeah, we talk about God's love and God's grace, but when you are by yourself, driving in your car, getting ready to go to sleep at night, when you're alone in your thoughts, do you wonder? Do you wonder sometimes if this love and this forgiveness and this grace, if it's really for you? Do you wonder what God's attitude is towards you? Well, Jesus tells us in Luke chapter 15, and the Bible tells us all throughout. But in Luke chapter 15, Jesus gives us three stories. Three stories about someone who's lost something and they're desperate to find it. He talks about a lost sheep. He talks about a lost coin. He talks about a lost son. The lost sheep is an interesting analogy because sheep aren't the smartest animals. They make mistakes. They do the wrong thing over and over again, and they often need to be rescued. And maybe that's why Jesus chose to portray that image. It's also an image that you see throughout Scripture of God as being the good, faithful shepherd that watches out for his sheep. In the parable of the lost coin, you think about when you lose something, and in this particular story, she's got 10 coins and she loses one. So a tenth of her wealth she's lost, and she's turning over the couch cushions and she's sweeping up and she's searching throughout the house for this lost coin until she finds it and she celebrates. And those are powerful images, but my favorite one starts in Luke chapter 15, verse 11. And Jesus talks about a man who had two sons. Nothing unusual about that so far, until we get to the point where the younger of the sons makes a request. He wants a share of his father's estate. Well, what does that mean? Well, he wants his inheritance before his father has died. Basically saying, Dad, I wish you were dead. The wealth that I'm going to gain from your death is more important to me than a relationship that I have with you. And so please, can I just have my inheritance now? And as the younger of the two brothers, he would have been entitled to a third of the estate. Well, the story talks about him being a landowner. He's the head of the household. Often the head of the household included many different family members, not just the immediate family, but aunts and uncles, all sorts of folks. But so a third of the estate is a lot. This is other people's money that they depend on to make it, to pay for expenses, to make sure that everybody is okay. But this one person saying, I am more important than the entire rest of the household. This request is something that is unthinkable. And everybody in the audience listening to this, as soon as they hear this request, to say, get out of here with this. There is no place for this, such an outrageous request. But in verse 12, the father does it. He grants his wishes. He gives him his estate before he's passed. Must be pretty wealthy to be able to afford to do that. So it must be a decent amount of money. And it talks in this story about the younger brother. You would hope, well, maybe he has some sense. Maybe he'll take, even though he's made this crazy request, well, maybe he'll have some sense and he'll take this money and he'll go and he'll make a life of it. But he squanders it. And it says he squanders his wealth in wild living, the NIV says. And as time goes on, there's a famine. He finds himself in this position where he's eating the pods of the pigs. And he's at this lowest point. He says, I'm going to go back home. Because at least if I go home, my father's servants, well, they eat better than this. And he goes back and says, I'm going to confess. And maybe my father will take me in as a hired hand. There's no way he's going to accept me back as a member of the family. But maybe, just maybe, I can go back and just get by, maybe be a beneficiary of the father's wealth. And as he's walking up onto the property in verse 20, when it says he's a long way off, the son is there. I'm sure he's rehearsing his lines. He's trying to make himself as repentant as possible. He's got his eyes turned to the ground. He's trying to be as respectful. He's trying to at least maybe grovel so that he can get back into some kind of good graces, so he'll at least be able to live on the property. He won't be able to be a part of the family, but at least live on the part of the property. But it says that while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him and ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. A couple things that are very significant about that description. First of all, he doesn't wait. God doesn't wait for us. The Father doesn't wait for the prodigal son. As soon as the son is in sight, a long ways off, he runs. Now, men in that culture do not run. It's undignified, especially an elder. It's undignified for them to run. They don't go out jogging or anything like that. It's not something that is done. But the Father loves his son so much that he runs. And he doesn't wait for an apology. He doesn't wait for a confession. He doesn't wait for anything. He runs up to him. He wraps his arms around him and he kisses him, is what it says here in the scripture. He throws a party for him. What does that say about God? What does that say about how God feels about you and how God feels about me? Well, if you go back to the beginning of the chapter, chapter 15, verses 1 and 2, who's his audience? The tax collectors and the sinners. They're the ones who have gathered around to listen to Jesus. And the Pharisees, those religious teachers, they're the ones standing at the outskirts sort of critiquing. Jesus doesn't really care about them. He cares about the outcast. He cares about the ones who feel like there's no way I can be forgiven. There's no way I can get back into the graces of God. Maybe I can just grovel at God's feet and maybe get the crumbs off God's table. That's not how God sees you and me. It's not how God sees us. No matter where we've been, no matter what we have done, we are God's kids, his beloved. He blesses us, and even if we squander the things that he's blessed us with, he does not hold that against us, but he still comes towards us with arms wide open. He runs towards us in relationship. God pursues us, and that is the story of Christmas. That is the theme of Advent this year, that God pursues us. He seeks after us. He chases after us. How does that feel? When you really think about it, when you think about God's posture as described in this parable in Luke 15, how does that connect to your experience with God? Maybe you've had feelings of guilt and shame. Maybe you've done things or maybe you've thought things that have keep you away from the church, because maybe when you go to church or when you go to a Bible study or when you are in a social situation with Christians, maybe that's the moment where you feel the most judged. Maybe that's the moment when you feel most excluded. Maybe that's the moment when you feel most an outcast. But I want to tell you, that's not the heart of God. The heart of God is to come and welcome you with open arms because God pursues us. So what are you going to do with that? What are you going to do with the truth that all this time when you feel like maybe you were seeking God, God was seeking you more? God doesn't stand on the porch of heaven with his arms crossed, pointing his finger in judgment and saying, well, I told you so. He says, come. Come and find true freedom. Come and find true life. Come and find true forgiveness. Come, because I'm already pursuing you. I've already got my arms wide open. The moment when we think maybe I'll start to consider God, God is there waiting with his arms wide open saying, I love you. So during this Advent season, how will you remind yourself that God pursues you? When you get caught up in the activity, when you get caught up in the parties, when you get caught up in all the things, how will you remember that at Christmas, God demonstrated his love to come and live life as one of us? And then how does that make you feel? I realize you might not be a feelings person. You might be more of a logic person. But how does it make you feel that God considers you so valuable that he relentlessly pursues you? He does not give up on you. He does not make you go into timeout or make you grovel or make you do some sort of penance. He just says, will you receive this gift of life, of forgiveness, of hope? Will you receive it that you might have life and have it to the full? How will you respond to God's pursuit of you today, throughout Advent, and into this next upcoming year? May you experience God's love, God's grace, God's peace, God's hope, God's joy in the person of Jesus this Advent. And may that bring you